a concrete sarcophagus buried 7 meters deep in the gut of Berlin, an impenetrable fortress designed to protect Adolf Hitler from his enemies. It's called the Führer Bunker.
Deep under the streets of Berlin, hidden from the chaos above, lay a concrete fortress that would become one of history's most infamous sites, the Führer Bunker. Built as a shelter, it transformed into the final stage of Adolf Hitler's rule, a place where power, paranoia, and collapse converged. Here, decisions were made, betrayals unfolded, and the dictator's life came to an end. Sealed after the war and buried beneath modern streets, the bunker still lingers as both mystery and warning, a chilling reminder of how even empires built on fear can crumble in silence. Designing a tomb, the architecture of paranoia. The Führer Bunker was more than just an air raid shelter. It was the physical embodiment of a dictator's fear, control, and obsession with survival. Its construction unfolded in 2 distinct phases, each one reflecting the escalating paranoia of Adolf Hitler as the war turned against him. The first stage began in 1936 with the creation of the Vorbunker, or forward bunker. Buried beneath the Reich Chancellery, this structure was simple and functional, a reinforced basement designed to shelter staff during bombing raids. At the time, Berlin was not under constant attack, and the bunker's design reflected that relative calm. It had thick walls, compact rooms, and basic ventilation. It was not luxurious, but it was secure. By 1943, however, the situation had changed dramatically. The Allied bombing campaign had intensified, and Berlin was no longer safe. Hitler's circle recognized that the Reich needed more than a shelter. It needed a fortress. And so, beneath the gardens of the Reich Chancellery, a second, far more elaborate bunker was constructed, the Führer Bunker. Completed in 1944, this underground labyrinth plunged 8.5 meters below the surface, deeper than any standard shelter. Its walls were up to 4 meters thick, designed to withstand direct hits from the heaviest bombs. The layout was grim and utilitarian. About 30 rooms spread across 2 levels, connected by narrow passageways and locked behind heavy steel doors. The air supply came from disguised ventilation towers above ground, while diesel generators provided power. Pumps constantly battled groundwater as Berlin's high water table threatened to flood the underground world. In every corner, the sense of confinement pressed down like the concrete itself. At its core lay Hitler's private quarters, a modest bedroom, a study hung with a portrait of Frederick the Great, and a nearby map room where military briefings unfolded daily. Eva Braun occupied an adjacent suite, decorated with furniture brought down from the Chancellery to soften the bunker's severe atmosphere. But no decorations could hide the damp walls, the smell of diesel fumes, or the claustrophobic weight of being buried alive beneath the city. The bunker was, in essence, a tomb built in advance. Though designed to project strength and endurance, it symbolized entrapment. Hitler could issue commands through its telephone lines and radios, but the world outside was slipping beyond his control. Each reinforcement, each sealed corridor, was a reflection not of victory, but of desperation. In creating a fortress, Hitler had also created the place where his regime would meet its end. Life underground, routines of a doomed dictator. By January 1945, the war had reached Berlin's doorstep. Allied forces pressed from the west, the Soviets advanced from the east, and the German capital was reduced to smoldering ruins. On January 16th, Adolf Hitler descended into the Führerbunker permanently. From that day forward, he would spend the last 105 days of his life sealed inside, surrounded by loyalists, secretaries, guards, and the suffocating air of impending defeat. The atmosphere inside the bunker was oppressive in both body and spirit. The walls constantly leaked moisture, requiring pumps to run day and night. The ventilation system hummed, but it could never fully erase the odors of damp concrete, cigarette smoke, sweat, and diesel. The corridors were narrow, the rooms stark, and the constant thunder of artillery above reminded everyone that Berlin was dying inch by inch. Despite the chaos outside, life underground followed a rigid routine. Hitler, ever bound to discipline, maintained a schedule. He rose late in the morning and immediately received military briefings in the map room. Generals and aides presented reports, though by the spring of 1945, those reports were nothing more than lists of defeats, retreats, and divisions that no longer existed except on paper. Hitler clung to the idea of counterattacks that could turn the tide, issuing orders to phantom armies as if sheer willpower could summon them into existence. Meals were another part of the routine. Hitler, a vegetarian, was served simple dishes of vegetables, pasta, or rice, while his staff ate heartier meals when rations allowed. These meals often took place in a small dining room where Eva Braun, his secretaries, and trusted aides joined him. Even here, the mood oscillated between forced normalcy and grim resignation. Eva Braun tried to preserve some sense of life beyond war. She entertained the bunker community with occasional screenings of films, laughter, and light conversation, though her cheerfulness could not hide the despair tightening around them all. Hitler himself often took short walks in the Chancellery garden above with his beloved German shepherd, Blondie. But as Soviet artillery grew heavier, even those moments of escape became impossible. The bunker community was small but tightly bound. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, Joseph Goebbels, who later brought his entire family underground, loyal aides like Heinz Linge and Otto Günsche, and the young secretaries Traudl Junge, Gerda Christian, and others. Each person played their role, though all knew they were trapped in a collapsing world. Inside the Führerbunker, time stretched unnaturally. Days blurred together, routines became rituals, and reality outside seemed both distant and terrifyingly close. Within those concrete walls, the dictator who once commanded vast armies now lived like a prisoner of his own making, his empire shrinking to a handful of rooms buried beneath Berlin. The encirclement. Berlin in flames. By April 1945, Berlin was no longer a city. It was a battlefield. The once grand boulevards of the capital were reduced to piles of rubble, and the sound of artillery echoed day and night. Soviet forces pressed in from the east, smashing through the suburbs, while Allied bombers continued to rain destruction from above. For the people trapped inside the city, survival meant little more than finding shelter and hoping the next shell would not find them. For Hitler and those within the Führerbunker, the situation grew increasingly desperate. The Red Army advanced with overwhelming numbers, bringing tanks, artillery, and infantry through streets that once symbolized Nazi power. Civilians, conscripts, and even children from the Hitler Youth were pressed into service to defend the crumbling city. They carried outdated rifles, Panzerfausts, or nothing more than the belief that sacrifice might buy a few more hours of resistance. On April 20th, 1945, Hitler emerged from the bunker for the last time. It was his 56th birthday. Frail, stooped, and visibly aged beyond his years, he greeted a group of Hitler youth who had fought to defend the ruins of Berlin. He awarded them the Iron Cross, a hollow gesture in the shadow of defeat. Witnesses recalled his shaking hands and sunken face, a stark contrast to the image of strength and power once projected across Germany. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere darkened with each passing hour. Reports from the front lines revealed the truth. Berlin was surrounded, the Wehrmacht was broken, and supplies were dwindling. Hitler's generals argued over strategies, but the discussions were meaningless. There were no reserves left to call upon, no counteroffensive waiting in the wings. The tension was palpable. Above ground, Soviet artillery shells shook the walls of the bunker, sending dust and fragments of plaster falling from the ceilings. The air carried the distant roar of tank engines and the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the ruined streets. Beneath that chaos, in dimly lit rooms lined with maps and desperate notes, Hitler clung to illusions of victory. Still, even as the city collapsed, life underground followed its grim routine. Meals were served, reports were delivered, but the air was thick with the knowledge that the end was inevitable. In the gardens above, shallow craters marked the relentless bombardment, while deep beneath the rubble, the dictator of Germany issued orders that no army could carry out. Berlin was burning. The Reich was crumbling. And in the bunker beneath the city, Hitler's world was shrinking to its final, suffocating hours. The collapse of loyalty. In the bunker's final weeks, Hitler's world was not only collapsing under the weight of Soviet artillery, but also crumbling from within. The man who demanded absolute loyalty from his followers now faced betrayal from some of his closest allies. What little trust remained began to erode, leaving him increasingly isolated, consumed by paranoia, and enraged by treachery. The most devastating blow came with news of Heinrich Himmler's actions. For years, Himmler had been among Hitler's most loyal subordinates, the head of the SS and one of the architects of the regime's brutality. Yet in April 1945, with Berlin surrounded and the war clearly lost, Himmler sought to save himself. He attempted to open secret negotiations with the Western Allies, offering surrender in exchange for clemency. When word of his betrayal reached the Führer bunker, Hitler erupted in fury. To him, it was the ultimate act of treason, a dagger in the back from a man he had trusted completely. Others followed similar paths of self-preservation. Hermann Göring, once considered Hitler's designated successor, sent a telegram suggesting he should take control of the Reich if Hitler was incapacitated. This message, though arguably pragmatic, was seen as another act of betrayal. Hitler denounced Göring, stripped him of all titles, and ordered his arrest. Even those who remained inside the bunker sensed the tightening noose. Generals presented strategies that could not be executed, divisions that existed only on paper, and promises that no longer carried weight. Hitler lashed out at them during briefings, accusing them of cowardice and incompetence. His rants grew more bitter as reality pressed harder against the walls of the underground fortress. The atmosphere among the staff grew equally grim. Secretaries and aides whispered of their despair, wondering what would become of them when the Soviets arrived. Some clung to their duties out of loyalty, others out of fear. But all knew they were witnessing the end of an empire. The bunker community became a strange mixture of forced routine and creeping dread. Conversations revolved around betrayal, treachery, and doom. Every act of disloyalty outside reinforced the sense of entrapment within. Hitler, once at the center of a vast empire, now ruled only over suspicion, shadows, and a handful of loyalists who could not or would not abandon him. The Führerbunker was meant to be a fortress. By April 1945, it had become a prison. And inside its damp, claustrophobic walls, Hitler's greatest fear had come true. Loyalty, the very foundation of his power, had shattered. The final acts: marriage, testament, and death. As April drew to a close, the bunker descended into a strange mixture of ritual and resignation. The Reich was finished. Berlin was surrounded, Soviet troops were only blocks away, and every report brought news of collapse. For Hitler, the end was no longer a distant possibility. It was at the door. In those final hours, he carried out symbolic acts meant to cement both his personal life and his political legacy, even as the walls of the bunker shook with the thunder of artillery. On the night of April 29, 1945, an unexpected ceremony unfolded underground. In a small, dimly lit corridor of the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. For years, she had lived largely in his shadow, present but hidden, rarely acknowledged in public. Now, with only a handful of witnesses, the two exchanged vows in a brief and almost surreal wedding. It was a final attempt at normality, a gesture of intimacy in a place designed for war and survival. Immediately after the wedding, Hitler dictated his last political testament. Seated at a desk in his study, with his secretary Traudl Junge typing every word, he crafted a document that condemned his enemies, denounced betrayal, and sought to justify his actions to history. He named successors, reaffirmed his ideological war, and tried to control the narrative of his downfall. Even as his empire lay in ruins, Hitler was determined to dictate how his story would be remembered. The following day, April 30th, marked the end. That morning, Hitler said his farewells to staff and aides who still remained. Some recalled his appearance as almost unrecognizable, pale, stooped, and trembling, a broken figure compared to the leader who once commanded millions. He ate a simple final meal with Eva Braun, then withdrew to his study. At around 3:30 p.m., Eva chose poison, swallowing a cyanide capsule. Hitler, unwilling to leave his death to chance, used a pistol. Witnesses outside the study heard the single gunshot that ended his life. Following his long-standing orders, aides moved quickly. The bodies were carried up the narrow staircase into the Chancellery garden. There, under heavy shell fire, they were doused with petrol and set alight in a shallow crater. The flames, fueled by desperation more than fuel supplies, consumed what they could. The attempt was to deny the Soviets the satisfaction of capturing Hitler's corpse. In that moment, deep beneath the burning city, the Third Reich ended. The bunker became not a fortress of survival, but a tomb. Its final act sealed in silence, smoke, and fire. The aftermath: Goebbels, Braun, and the survivors. With Hitler gone, the bunker fell into a heavy silence. For a moment, those who remained inside seemed stunned, as if the reality of what had just happened had yet to settle. The dictator whose presence had dominated every corner of their lives was no longer there. Yet outside, the bombardment continued, and the Soviets pressed ever closer. The war did not pause for grief. The vacuum of leadership was immediate. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's minister of propaganda, declared himself chancellor in accordance with Hitler's final testament. But his rule lasted less than a day. Goebbels and his wife, Magda, had already decided their fates. To them, life without Hitler and life in a world without National Socialism was unthinkable. Even more chilling was their decision regarding their 6 young children, who had been brought into the bunker during its final weeks. On May 1st, Magda Goebbels prepared the children for bed. One by one, with the assistance of an SS doctor, they were given sedatives, then cyanide capsules. None survived. It was one of the most haunting acts of loyalty to a fallen regime, and a reminder of the depth of fanaticism that had consumed the bunker's final occupants. Later that same day, Joseph and Magda walked into the garden above and ended their own lives, she by poison, he by gunshot. Their bodies were partially burned, much like Hitler and Eva Braun, though the flames consumed little. Others sought escape. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, attempted to break out of Berlin. He fled through the ruins with a small group, but chaos swallowed them. For years, rumors circulated about his survival until his remains were finally identified decades later, confirming he had died during the escape attempt. Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, and Otto Günsche, his adjutant, were captured by the Soviets, providing first-hand accounts of the Führer's final hours. Traudl Junge, the young secretary who had typed Hitler's last testament, managed to slip away into the chaos of Berlin before being captured and interrogated. Rochus Misch, the radio operator who had transmitted Hitler's last communications, also survived, continuing to broadcast until the very end before fleeing. The bunker itself emptied quickly after Hitler's death. Those who stayed too long were seized by the Soviets. Those who fled risked capture, death, or anonymity in the ruins of the collapsing city. In the end, only fragments of testimony remained to describe the surreal, suffocating atmosphere of those last days. What had begun as a fortress of survival ended as a graveyard of loyalty, despair, and destruction. The Führer bunker was no longer the seat of power. It was a monument to collapse, the Soviet discovery. On May 2, 1945, Berlin surrendered. Soviet troops surged through the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, their boots crunching over broken stone and scorched debris. Amid the destruction, they located the entrance to the Führer bunker, the underground lair that had once housed Hitler and his closest followers. To the men who stepped inside, it must have seemed like a ghostly world, dark, silent, and filled with the remnants of a regime that had just annihilated itself. The corridors were littered with broken furniture, scattered documents, and the smell of fire still clinging to the walls. The atmosphere was suffocating. What had once been a command center for Europe's most feared dictator was now a ruin of smoke-stained ceilings and overturned tables. Soviet soldiers moved cautiously, searching not only for intelligence, but for Hitler himself. Rumors swirled that he might still be alive, hidden somewhere in the city, or attempting to flee. In shallow craters outside the Chancellery Garden, Soviet investigators found burned remains, charred bodies doused in petrol and hastily set alight. Could these be Hitler and Eva Braun? The remains were quickly collected and sent for examination. But instead of clarity, the discovery only deepened the mystery. Joseph Stalin, ever the strategist of deception, saw an opportunity. Rather than announcing Hitler's death, he ordered secrecy. Publicly, Soviet officials suggested Hitler had escaped, perhaps to Argentina or Spain. At the Potsdam Conference later that year, Stalin even told Western leaders that the dictator was alive, fueling suspicion and conspiracy. To Stalin, keeping the world uncertain was a tool of power. Inside the bunker, the Soviets catalogued what remained. They found blood-stained furniture, cyanide capsules, half-burned papers, and personal items belonging to Hitler and Eva Braun. Maps still covered the walls of the command rooms, notes scribbled in haste as Berlin fell apart above. The radio equipment lay silent, its last broadcasts already sent into the chaos. Even Hitler's dog, Blondie, was discovered, poisoned before her master's suicide, a grim reflection of his growing paranoia. In the months and years that followed, the Soviets attempted to erase the site itself. The Reich Chancellery was demolished in 1947, and repeated efforts were made to destroy the bunker beneath. Yet the deepest sections resisted, surviving explosions and demolition work. By the 1980s, the remains of the Führer bunker were finally buried beneath housing blocks and parking lots, hidden from public view. What the Red Army found in 1945 shocked the world, but what they chose to reveal and conceal changed history. The bunker was not just a ruin of concrete, it was now a weapon of secrecy, a stage for propaganda, and the beginning of decades of speculation. The forensic puzzle: teeth, bones, and lies. For all the chaos surrounding the Führer bunker, the question that lingered most was simple. Did Hitler really die there? The Soviets claimed to have found his remains, yet their refusal to release evidence left the world in doubt. What should have been a straightforward case of death became one of history's most disputed forensic puzzles. Among the fragments recovered by Soviet investigators were charred bones, jaw sections, and dental bridges. These grisly remains became the focus of examination. Since Hitler's body had been partially burned, identification relied on his distinctive dental work. His personal dentist, Hugo Blaschke, had fled Berlin, but his assistants, Käthe Häusermann and Fritz Echtmann, were captured and interrogated. When shown the remains, they described the fillings, crowns, and bridges in detail, confirming they matched Hitler's unique dental records. Their testimony provided the first strong link between the remains and the dictator himself. Yet Stalin's decision to suppress this information cast an immediate shadow of suspicion. Instead of confirming Hitler's death, he fueled rumors of escape. To the Western Allies, the secrecy was baffling. Why conceal the truth if the dictator was truly dead? The lack of transparency allowed conspiracy theories to flourish. For decades, the Soviets guarded the evidence in secret archives. Then, in 1946, reports emerged of a skull fragment with a bullet hole, allegedly belonging to Hitler. This piece of bone was displayed in Moscow as definitive proof of suicide. But in the early 2000s, DNA testing shattered that claim. The skull belonged not to a man, but to a woman under 40. The revelation reignited doubts. If the skull wasn't Hitler's, had the Soviets fabricated evidence? Or had they simply misidentified remains during the chaotic aftermath? It wasn't until 2018 that modern science offered clarity. A French forensic team was granted access to the jawbone fragments still held in Moscow. Using surviving X-rays of Hitler's skull taken in 1944, they compared the structures and confirmed an exact match. Their conclusion was firm. The jawbone belonged to Adolf Hitler. Despite decades of conspiracy, the forensic evidence was undeniable. Even so, the puzzle remains unsettling. The burned bodies, the misidentified skull, the secrecy, all contributed to the myth that Hitler had escaped justice. The remains that should have closed the case instead prolonged uncertainty. What is clear is this: Hitler did not flee to Argentina or Spain. He did not vanish into the shadows. His empire ended in the bunker, and his body, reduced to fragments of bone and teeth, was proof of a dictator's downfall. But thanks to Soviet silence, the truth became a riddle that still fascinates the world. The shadow of conspiracy. The fall of Berlin should have ended speculation about Hitler's fate. He had died in his bunker, his body partially burned in the garden above, his empire reduced to rubble. But secrecy breeds suspicion, and Stalin's deliberate disinformation campaign ensured that uncertainty would linger. Almost immediately, conspiracy theories took root, spreading across continents and generations. One of the most powerful myths claimed that Hitler had escaped to South America. According to these stories, he boarded a U-boat from northern Germany and sailed across the Atlantic. Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil were often named as safe havens, with whispers of secluded estates built for him in the Andes. These rumors were not entirely implausible, as many high-ranking Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann and Josef Mengele, did manage to flee to South America after the war. But none of the documented evidence ever placed Hitler there. Another theory suggested that Hitler had relied on a double. Nazi officials were known to use lookalikes for public appearances, and some claimed one of these men had been sacrificed in the bunker while Hitler slipped away. Soviet officers, under pressure from Stalin, even fueled this idea by referring to the corpse as a possible double. Such statements, though politically useful, only deepened global suspicion. The fascination grew over the years. Newspapers published sketches of possible escape routes. Magazines speculated about secret hideouts in monasteries or remote farms. In 1945, a U.S. poll revealed that nearly 70% of Americans believed Hitler was still alive. The world was not ready to accept that one of history's most infamous figures had died so suddenly, so anticlimactically, in a sealed bunker. The 1980s brought a new wave of intrigue with the so-called Hitler Diaries. Published by major European outlets, the diaries claimed to be Hitler's private journals, recovered from East Germany. Historians initially embraced them as authentic, but within weeks they were exposed as forgeries. The scandal reinforced the sense that Hitler's story was forever vulnerable to manipulation. Even intelligence agencies fed the myth. The CIA and FBI received dozens of reports of alleged Hitler sightings, from Argentina to New York. Each was investigated. None were substantiated. By the 1950s, both agencies had concluded that the dictator had indeed died in Berlin, yet the rumors refused to die with him. Ultimately, conspiracy theories thrived because the truth was kept hidden. Stalin's silence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum grew tales of escape, survival, and secret lives. The evidence, the dental remains, eyewitness testimony, forensic studies, points clearly to Hitler's death in April 1945. But the human desire for unfinished stories, for mysteries that never close, has kept the shadow of doubt alive, erasing the bunker, remembering the past. When the guns of 1945 finally fell silent, the Führer bunker remained buried beneath Berlin like a scar the city wanted to forget. For the Soviet occupiers, the underground fortress was a problem. On one hand, it was a powerful symbol of victory over Nazi Germany. On the other, It risked becoming a shrine for those who still clung to the ideology of Hitler's regime. The solution, in their eyes, was simple: erase it. In 1947, demolition crews set to work. The Reich Chancellery, once the nerve center of Nazi power, was reduced to rubble. Attempts were made to destroy the bunker as well, with explosives and heavy machinery tearing through its reinforced walls. But the Führer bunker had been built to endure bombings, and its deepest sections resisted destruction. Thick concrete walls and steel reinforcements made complete eradication nearly impossible. Over the following decades, authorities made repeated efforts to finish the job. In the 1950s, and again in the 1980s, sections were filled in, flooded, or buried under new construction. Eventually, apartment blocks and parking lots covered the site. By the time East Germany redeveloped the area, little remained accessible, and the Führer bunker had disappeared beneath ordinary urban life. The deliberate concealment was part of a broader effort to control memory. East German authorities, in particular, did not want the site to become a pilgrimage destination for neo-Nazis. For decades, official maps did not mark its location, and its existence was downplayed in public discourse. The bunker, once the seat of Nazi command, was reduced to silence, sealed away from sight and mind. Yet history has a way of resurfacing. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, researchers and city planners acknowledged the site more openly. By then, the area had been fully redeveloped, but historians identified the approximate location. Today, visitors walking through Berlin's Wilhelmstrasse district would find nothing resembling the infamous bunker. Instead, they would see apartment buildings, car parks, and playgrounds. Only a small, modest information plaque, erected in 2006, marks the spot, providing context rather than glorification. This erasure has sparked debate. Some argue the decision was correct, preventing the site from being exploited by extremists. Others believe burying it has denied future generations the chance to confront history directly. Museums and memorials exist across Germany to acknowledge the crimes of the Nazi regime, but the Führer bunker remains hidden, a ghost beneath the city. In the end, Berlin chose absence over presence. The most infamous bunker in history lies beneath asphalt and concrete, unseen but never forgotten. Its destruction was meant to erase memory, yet its very absence continues to fuel fascination. Unfinished history, why the bunker still haunts us. The Führer bunker was meant to be hidden, destroyed, and erased. Yet nearly 8 decades later, its story still grips the imagination of historians, filmmakers, and ordinary people alike. Why does a buried structure, long gone from the surface of Berlin, continue to cast such a powerful shadow? The answer lies in what it represents: the collapse of tyranny, the fragility of loyalty, and the human fascination with mysteries that never quite close. At its core, the bunker is more than a physical ruin. It is a symbol of the way absolute power ends, not in glory or triumph, but in paranoia, confinement, and silence. Hitler, who once commanded armies across Europe, spent his final months shuffling through damp corridors, issuing orders to divisions that no longer existed, and railing against betrayals he could not stop. The bunker reflects the irony of power. Even the most dominant leaders can be reduced to prisoners of their own delusions. It also endures because of the unanswered questions. The secrecy of the Soviets ensured that clarity was replaced by conspiracy. The misidentified skull fragment Stalin's deliberate disinformation, and the long silence of Moscow's archives all fed decades of speculation. For many, the story of Hitler's death feels unfinished, not because the evidence is lacking, but because the mystery was deliberately cultivated. In that uncertainty lies the allure. The fascination is also cultural. The bunker has become the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films. From eyewitness accounts like those of Traudl Junge to dramatizations in cinema, each retelling attempts to illuminate what happened in those final days. Yet no matter how detailed the reconstructions, a sense of claustrophobic dread always lingers. The bunker is not just history. It is storytelling at its darkest, a setting where myth and reality merge. There is also a warning embedded in its legacy. To some, erasing the site was necessary to prevent it from becoming a shrine. To others, the absence is troubling. By burying it, Berlin left a void where education and confrontation might have taken place. The modest plaque that now marks the location is intentionally unremarkable, offering no spectacle, no glorification, only facts. It forces visitors to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that some parts of history must be remembered without monuments. Ultimately, the Führer bunker endures because it represents unfinished history. It is both gone and present, destroyed yet remembered, concealed yet endlessly studied. It reminds us that tyranny often ends not with a roar, but with a whimper in a sealed room. And it warns us that myths thrive when silence is allowed to fill the gaps of truth. Today, if you walk across the quiet parking lot that covers its remains, you might never guess the weight of history buried beneath your feet. But the bunker's story lives on, not in concrete or steel, but in the questions it left behind. Did Hitler die as the evidence shows, or did the conspiracies hold a kernel of truth? The answer, while seemingly resolved, will always stir debate. The Führer bunker was a fortress, a prison, and a tomb. It was the stage where one of history's darkest chapters ended. And though the site itself has vanished beneath modern Berlin, its shadow will never fade.